Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. The mystery of the Sesemann ghost has been solved. And without delay, in order to save her life, Heidi is allowed to go back up to her beloved mountain meadow with grandfather and the goats, and grandmother, and goat Peter. When has a homecoming ever been so joyful, and the sounds of home so welcome? Rejoice with Heidi in her return to the place she has so longed to be. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Heidi, Chapter 13. A Journey Back to the Mountain Meadow. Mr. Sesemann climbed the stairs in much excitement and went straight toward Lady Rottenmeier's room. His knock on the door of this apartment was so unusually loud that the housekeeper started out of her sleep with a cry of fear. She heard the master's voice outside saying, "Please come to the dining room as fast as you can. We have to get things ready at once for a journey." Miss Rottenmeier looked at her clock. It was 4:30 in the morning. She had never in all her life got up so early. What on earth could have happened? She was so curious and eager that she did everything wrong and could hardly get dressed. She kept hunting around the room for clothes that she had already put on. In the meantime, Mr. Sesemann went down the hall and rang each one of the bells that was used for calling the servants. And in each room that had a bell, a terrified form sprang out of bed and started to put on his clothes wrong side out, because, one and all, they immediately thought the ghost had somehow got hold of the master of the house, and this was his summons for help. So one by one they came stealing down, each one, if possible, looking worse than the one before him, and they drew up in surprise before the master of the house, for Mr. Sesemann was walking up and down the room, looking fresh and cheerful, and not in the least as if he had been scared by a ghost. Johann was at once sent to harness the horses to the carriage, so that it might be ready when wanted. Tinette was ordered to waken Heidi without delay and to dress her for a journey. Sebastian was told to run to the house where Heidi's aunt worked, and to bring her back with him. Meanwhile, Miss Rottenmeier had finally finished dressing. Her clothes were on straight enough, except for her boudoir cap, which was on wrong side before, so that from a distance it looked as if her face was on backward. Mr. Sesemann realized that her odd appearance was due to the fact that she had risen so early, and he therefore went straight to the business before them. He explained to the surprised lady that she was to get down a trunk at once and pack in it all the things that belonged to the Swiss child. He spoke of Heidi usually this way because her name still seemed somewhat strange to him. He also told the housekeeper to put in a good many of Clara's clothes, so that the child might have a proper outfit to take home with her. But everything must be done quickly, and without waiting to decide one way or the other. Miss Rottenmeier stood as if rooted to the spot, staring at Mr. Sesemann in great surprise. She had thought he was going to tell her some terrible story about the ghost he had met the night before, and now that it was bright daylight, she would have listened gladly. Instead of which, he was now giving her these everyday orders. She was not quick enough to hide her disappointment. Without a word, she kept standing there, waiting for what he would say next. But Mr. Sesemann had no intention of clearing up matters. He let the lady stand just where she was, and went to his daughter's room. Just as he had feared, the unusual stir had awakened Clara, and she was listening to all the sounds about her and wondering what was going on. Her father sat down beside her bed and told her the whole history of the ghost affair, He said that the doctor thought Heidi was in very bad shape, and unless something was done about it, she might start wandering in her sleep farther and farther away, and even climb out on the roof, which would be a very dangerous thing. So he had made up his mind to send Heidi home on the spot, because he was afraid to run such a risk, and Clara must not feel bad at losing Heidi, for she could see that it was the only thing left for Papa to do. Clara was much surprised at this news, and at first wanted to find some way of keeping Heidi with her, but all in vain. Father remained firm in his decision, and yet he promised to go to Switzerland with Clara the following year, if she would be sensible now and not start to fret. So Clara gave in cheerfully to what could not be helped, but begged as a reward for being good that Heidi's trunk might be brought into her room and packed there, so that she could put in it whatever she took a fancy to. Her papa granted her this favor very willingly, and besides, he encouraged Clara to fit out Heidi with a fine stock of clothes. It was then that Aunt Didi arrived, and stood in the reception hall with great expectations, for it must have taken something quite out of the usual run to make her coming at such a strange hour necessary. Mr. Sesemann went out to see her, and told her how things stood with Heidi. He asked her if she would take the child home with her at once that very day. The aunt looked very much disappointed. She had expected anything but that. She still had a very clear memory of the parting words that Nuncle had hurled after her. "Never come into my sight again!" And to bring him the child he had not wanted then, to take her away again, and then to fetch her back? No, that did not seem to be exactly a good stroke of business for her. So, without thinking the matter over at any length, she said that, unfortunately, it would be impossible for her to take a trip that day, and the day after it would be even more out of the question because of all the things she simply must do then, and afterward she doubted if she could go any better. Mr. Sesemann saw through these excuses, and sent Aunt Didi away without bothering about her further. He then sent for Sebastian, and informed him that he must get ready to make the trip right away. He would travel with the child that day as far as Basel. The next day they would reach her home. Then he could start back at once. He would have no explanations to offer, for a letter to Heidi's grandfather would make everything clear to him. "But now, Sebastian," Mr. Sesemann said in conclusion, "there is one thing I want you to do especially, and you just see that you don't forget about it. I know the hotel in Basel, the name of which I've written down on this business card for you. When they see the card, they will show you to a good room for the child. As to your own self, you know what to do. Go first thing into Heidi's room and nail every window so tightly shut that it cannot be opened except by the greatest force. And after the child is once in bed, then go and lock her door on the outside, for the youngster wanders around in her sleep, and might run into any sort of danger in a strange place. If she should, for instance, leave her room and try to open the front door. Are you sure you understand?" "Aha! So that's what it was. That's the way of it," Sebastian gasped in the greatest surprise, for he had at that moment seen a great light about the ghost business. "Yes, that is exactly what was up. And you are a fraidy cat, and you can tell Johann from me that he's another one just like you. In fact, you are a silly crowd of people." With these words, Mr. Sesemann went to his room, and sat down to write a letter to Meadow Nuncle. As for Sebastian, he felt terribly put out. He stood in the middle of the room and kept repeating to himself over and over, "If only I hadn't let that coward Johann jerk me back into the room where we had been watching. If I had only gone after that little white form myself, and I'll bet I would have done it too." The butler quite convinced himself of his own bravery, for at this moment the clear sunshine was brightly lighting up every corner of the usually dim apartment. Meanwhile, Heidi, with never a thought of what was going to happen, stood waiting in her best Sunday dress, for Tinette had merely shaken her out of her sleep taken her clothes from the closet, and helped her to dress, without saying a word. She never talked with Heidi, whom she thought uncityfied and beneath her notice. With his letter in his hand, Mr. Sesemann walked into the dining room, where breakfast was awaiting him, and called, "Where's the child?" Heidi was sent for. When she went up to the master of the house to wish him good morning, he looked into her face questioningly and asked, "Well, what have you to say to all this, my dear?" Heidi gazed up at him in astonishment. "I suppose you don't know anything about it even now," Mr. Sesemann said with a laugh. "Well, you are going home today, and almost right away." "Home?" Heidi repeated after him dully, and grew as white as snow. For a moment she could scarcely breathe. Her heart was beating so violently at the statement. "Would you like to hear some more about it?" Mr. Sesemann asked, smiling kindly. "Oh, yes, indeed I should," Heidi finally managed to gasp, and her cheeks had got dark red. "Good. Then you shall hear," her companion said encouragingly. He seated himself and motioned to Heidi to do likewise. "But first you must eat a hearty breakfast, and then into the carriage and off with you." Hard as she tried, Heidi could not swallow a mouthful, although she obediently tried to force herself to do it. She was so wrought up that she did not know whether she was awake or dreaming. She feared she would suddenly wake up and find herself standing in her nightgown at the entrance door. "Sebastian must remember to take plenty of provisions," Mr. Sesemann called to the housekeeper, who was just coming into the room. "The child can't eat now, nor would anyone expect her to." Then he turned to Heidi and said kindly, "Why don't you run in to see Clara, and wait there until the carriage comes?" That was just what Heidi wished for, and she ran across the hall to Clara. In the middle of her friend's room there was an enormous trunk, the top of which still stood wide open. "Oh, Heidi, come here," Clara called to her. "Come, see what I have packed for you. Don't you like it?" And she told off on her fingers a whole list of things, dresses and aprons, towels and sewing material. "Look here, Heidi," Clara cried, and held a basket aloft in triumph. Heidi peered into it, and then had to jump around for joy, because in the basket there was a round dozen of pretty white rolls, all for grandmother. So happy were the children that they both quite forgot that the moment of their parting was at hand. And when the call did suddenly come, "The carriage is waiting," there was no time left to be sad in. Heidi flew to her room. The pretty book Grandmamma had given her must be lying there still. No one could have packed it, for it lay under the pillow, because Heidi could not bear to be separated from it by day or night. She found the book and laid it in the basket on top of the rolls. Then she opened her bureau to see if there was anything nice that had not been packed already. And there, sure enough, lay the old red neckerchief. Miss Rottenmeier had thought it too poor a thing to be worth packing. Heidi wrapped it around some other object and put it on the very top of the basket, so that the red package became very noticeable. Then she set her fine new hat on her head and left the room. The children had to say goodbye quickly, for Mr. Sesemann was waiting to take Heidi down to the carriage. Miss Rottenmeier stood at the head of the stairs to bid Heidi farewell. As she caught sight of the strange little red bundle, she snatched it from the basket and threw it to the floor. "No, Adelheid," she said reprovingly. "You can't leave this house looking like that. You don't need to take any such stuff with you anyway. And now, goodbye." After this reproof, Heidi did not dare pick her bundle up again, but she looked at the master of the house with an imploring glance, as if she were being robbed of her greatest treasure. "Oh, no, no," Mr. Sesemann said in a very decided tone of voice. "Heidi is going to take home with her just whatever she wants to. Even if it turns out to be kittens or turtles, we won't bother about it, Miss Rottenmeier." Heidi quickly picked her bundle up from the floor, and her eyes shone with thankfulness and joy. When she had got to the carriage, Mr. Sesemann took her hand in his and told her very nicely she must not forget him and his daughter Clara. He gave her his best wishes for a pleasant journey, and in her turn, Heidi thanked him with her whole heart for the kindness he had shown her. Her final message was, And I leave 1,000 greetings for the doctor, and many, many thanks. For she had not forgotten that he had told her the night before, Tomorrow everything is going to be all right. Now it had all come true, and Heidi thought he had brought it about. Then the child was lifted into the carriage, and the basket, and the bag of provisions, and Sebastian followed. Mr. Sesemann called again to her, Pleasant journey, and the carriage rolled away. Soon afterward, Heidi was sitting in the train and holding the basket firmly in her lap. She would not let it out of her hands for a single minute, because grandmother's precious rolls were inside it. She had to guard them carefully and take a look at them from time to time, just for fun. For several hours, Heidi sat as still as a mouse. She was just beginning to understand that she was really on her way home to grandfather on the mountain meadow, to grandmother, and to Goat Peter. Happy scenes from the past came to her mind, one after the other, and she dreamed of all the things she was again going to see, and how wonderful everything would look. New thoughts flooded in upon her, and suddenly she grew a little afraid. Sebastian, didn't grandmother on the mountain really die after all? She asked. Oh, no, he said consolingly. We'll hope she didn't. She'll be alive all right. Then Heidi was again buried in her thoughts, but every once in a while she would take a peek into the basket, for her dearest wish in life had now come to be to lay all the rolls on grandmother's table. After some time she asked again, Sebastian, don't you suppose that we can be certain that grandmother's still alive? Why, of course we can, her companion answered, half asleep. She's alive fast enough. Don't see why she shouldn't be, do you? After a while, Heidi's eyes closed too. Because of the restless night and her early rising, she was so dead with sleep that she did not wake up until Sebastian gave her arm a good shaking and called out to her, Wake up in a hurry, Heidi. Get out right away. We've come to Basel. Next morning, their long journey continued for many hours. In the child's lap again rested the basket, which she would on no condition let Sebastian take care of. But today she did not speak a single word, because each new hour that came made her eagerness greater. She could hardly wait, and then suddenly, just when she least expected it, the loud call was heard. All out for Mayenfeld. Heidi jumped up from her seat, and so did Sebastian, who was as surprised as she was. In a moment, they found themselves out on the platform with the trunk, and the train was whistling farther on up in the valley. Sebastian cast a longing look after the departing train, for he much preferred traveling so safely and easily to starting out on a foot tour which would end in a stiff bit of mountain climbing. Besides, he feared that the climb would be hard and dangerous in this land, where everything seemed to him to be still in a half-wild condition. So he looked around for someone who would show him the safest way to the hamlet. Not far from the railway station, a small rack wagon was standing, with a lean horse attached to it. A broad-shouldered man was occupied in loading it with several large sacks of flour that had been brought up by the train. Sebastian hailed him, and asked which was the safest way to Dörfli. All the roads are safe hereabouts, was the short answer. But Sebastian persisted in asking him the best way to take, so as not to fall over the cliffs, and how one could have a trunk set up to this particular place called the hamlet. The man looked at the trunk, and measured its weight with his eyes. Then he said that if it was not too heavy, he could himself take it on his wagon, as he was bound for Dörfli himself. After some little further talk, the two men at last agreed that the child and the trunk should be taken along in the rack wagon, and then Heidi could be sent from Durfley up the mountain meadow with someone later in the evening. "I can go by myself. I know the way from the hamlet up to the mountain meadow," Heidi said at this point, for she had been listening eagerly while the two men bargained. A heavy load was taken from Sebastian's heart when he saw himself freed from the necessity of clambering up the mountain. He beckoned to Heidi secretly to come to one side with him, and he handed her a thick round bundle and a letter for her grandfather. The round bundle, he explained, was a gift from Mr. Sesemann. She must hide it in the bottom of the basket, away down under the bread rolls, and she must take good care to see that it was not lost, or Mr. Sesemann would be awfully angry and would never get over it his whole life long. Little Mamselle would do good to remember this. "Oh, I won't lose it," Heidi said, and she placed the thick roll and the letter in the lower part of the basket. The trunk was then set on the wagon, and Sebastian lifted the child and her precious bundle up to the high seat beside the driver. The servant shook hands with her and said goodbye, and once more urged her with all sorts of signs to keep careful watch of the contents of her basket, for the driver was close by them, and Sebastian was by no means easy in his mind, because he knew that he himself should have gone with Heidi to the end of her journey. At last the driver swung himself up on the seat next to Heidi, and the wagon rolled off toward the mountains, while Sebastian, happy to escape the dreaded climb, sat down beside the little railway station to wait for the return train. The man on the wagon was the baker of Durfley, who was driving home with his sacks of flour. He had never seen Heidi before, but like everyone else in the hamlet, he knew about the child that had been brought to Meadownunkle. What is more, he had known Heidi's father and mother, so of course he guessed at once that she was the little girl people talked about so much. He could not help being surprised that the child was coming back home so soon, and while they were driving along, he began to talk with Heidi. "I suppose you must be the child who lived up at Meadownunkle's, at your grandfather's." "Yes." "Did they treat you so badly in Frankfurt that you came home before you expected to? And all that distance?" "No, I got along just fine. Nobody could be treated better than I was in Frankfurt." "Why are you running home, then?" "Just because Mr. Sesemann said I could, or I shouldn't have gone away at all." "Ha! Why didn't you want to stay down there anyway, even if they did let you go?" "Because I'd 1,000 times rather go home to grandfather up on the mountain meadow than do anything else in the world." "I guess you'll think differently when you're once up there again," the baker said with a grunt, and he said to himself, "But I wonder if she knows how bad it is." Then he began to whistle a tune, and had nothing more to say. Heidi looked around her, and she was so excited that she fairly trembled. She recognized the trees by the roadside, and up above loomed the sharp peaks of the high Falkness mountain, looking down at her in greeting, like good old friends. Heidi waved her hand to them joyously. Every step the horse took, Heidi's excitement grew more intense, and she almost thought she would have to jump down from the wagon and run with might and main until she reached the very top of Falkness. But she sat very still and made no move, although her brain whirled on and on until she was dizzy. The clock struck 5, just as they drove into the hamlet. In no time at all, a troop of women and children crowded around the wagon, and a couple of men from neighboring houses came out to join the company, for the sight of a child and a trunk on the baker's wagon had attracted the attention of all the people, and everyone wanted to know where they had come from, and where they were going, and to whom they belonged. Hardly had the baker lifted Heidi to the ground, when she said to him quickly, "Thank you. Grandfather will be down for the trunk soon." And she would have run away, but she was held in on every side by the crowd. There was a chorus of voices, all talking at once, and each asking a different question. Heidi forced her way through the throng with such a look of anxiety on her face that they made room for her to pass, and they said to each other, "You see how frightened she is, don't you? Well, she has good reason to be." Then they started to tell one another how during the past year, Meadow Nuncle had been getting worse than ever. He would no longer exchange a word with anyone, and if you happened to get in his way, he glared at you as if he wanted to hurt you. And if the child had only the sense she was born with, she wouldn't be running up there to the old dragon's nest. But at last the baker managed to get a word in edgewise. He said he knew more about it than all the rest of them put together. And then, with a great air of secrecy, he told how a gentleman had brought the child as far as Mayenfeld. There he had said goodbye to the child in the friendliest sort of way. Then, without trying to beat down the price the baker had asked for her fare, the gentleman had paid it, and had added a good tip, too. And besides, he knew for sure that the child had been well cared for in Frankfurt, and herself had wanted to come back to her grandfather. The baker's news caused much amazement, and his story was spread like lightning through Dorfli. And that evening there was not a cottage in all the hamlet where they did not gossip about the child who wanted to give up a life of ease and plenty to return to her grandfather. Heidi ran up the mountain from the hamlet as fast as ever she could, stopping a moment every now and then to catch her breath. The basket on her arm was fairly heavy for her to carry, and besides, the higher she went, the steeper the trail grew. There was room for but a single thought in Heidi's heart. Will grandmother still be sitting at her place by the spinning wheel in the corner? Did she die while I was gone so long? Now Heidi caught sight of the hut up in the hollow by the mountain meadow, and her heart began to pound. She ran still faster, and her heart began to beat more loudly. At last she was there! She could scarcely open the door, she was trembling so. But finally she managed to lift the latch. She sprang into the middle of the little living room and stood there, all out of breath and unable to utter a sound. "Heavens above!" a voice cried from the corner. "That's the way our Heidi used to run in. Oh, if she could only be with me once more before I die. Who is it?" "Here I am, grandmother. It's really me," Heidi called. She rushed over to the old lady in the corner and plumped down on her knees beside her. She seized grandmother's arm, and her hands pressed tightly against her, and was speechless, she was so happy. At first, grandmother herself was so surprised that she also could find nothing to say. But then she began to stroke Heidi's curly hair, and to say over and over again, "Yes, yes, that's her hair, and that's her voice. I thank thee, dear God, that thou hast let me live to see this day." And two great tears of joy fell from the old blind eyes down on Heidi's hand. "Is it really you, dear? Have you come back to me at last?" "Oh, surely it's me, grandmother," Heidi said gently. "But don't you cry, for I'm back here to stay, and I'm coming to see you every day, and will never leave you again. And you won't need to eat hard bread for many a day either. See, grandmother, what I brought you." And Heidi now drew one roll after another out of her basket, until she had heaped all 12 of them on grandmother's lap. "Oh, my dear child, what is this blessed gift you have brought me?" the old lady cried in her astonishment, for it seemed as if the supply of rolls would never end. They followed one another so endlessly. "But the greatest blessing of all is just you, child." Then she ran her fingers again through Heidi's curls, and stroked the hot cheeks, and said, "Say just one more word, dear, anything, so I can hear the sound of your voice." Then it was that Heidi told grandmother how fearfully afraid she had been that she might die when her little child was far away. Then she could not have brought her the promised white rolls, and could never have come to see her again. Peter's mother came in while they were talking together. She stopped short and stared, as if she could not trust her eyes. Then she cried, "As I live, it's Heidi! But how can that ever be?" Heidi got up from her knees and shook hands with her, and Brigitte could not get over her surprise at Heidi's changed appearance. She walked around the child once or twice and said, "Grandmother, if only you could see what a lovely dress the child has on, and how fine she looks. You would hardly recognize her. And the little hat trimmed with feathers there on the table, is that yours too? Do put it on so I can see if it's becoming." "No, I don't want to," said Heidi firmly. "You can have it if you'll take it. I don't need it any longer. I have another one I like better." Then Heidi unwrapped her small red bundle and took out her old hat, which had become still more cracked during her journey from Frankfurt than it was before. But that did not bother Heidi any, for she had never forgotten how, when she was leaving grandfather, he had shouted after her that he didn't ever want to see her in a hat trimmed with feathers. And that was the reason Heidi had saved her old hat so carefully, because she was always dreaming of the time when she would be going back to him. Brigitte told her not to be so silly. If she did not want to wear the hat, it was such a splendid one that she could sell it perhaps to the daughter of the Dörfli school teacher. She could get a lot of money for it. But Heidi stuck stubbornly to her decision. When Brigitte was not looking, she put the hat quietly in the corner behind grandmother, where it was out of sight. Then she slipped quickly out of her pretty dress, and she wound the red neckerchief over her underwaist, in which she was now standing with bare arms. She seized grandmother's hand and said, "Now I must run home to grandfather, but I'll come to see you again tomorrow. Good night, grandmother." "Yes, do come again, Heidi, by all means. Until tomorrow, then," said the grandmother, and she squeezed the child's hand in both of hers and could hardly let her go. "But why did you take off your pretty dress?" Brigitte asked. "Because I'd rather go to grandfather this way, or perhaps he would not know me. You hardly did." Brigitte followed Heidi out of the door and said a few words secretly to her. "You could have kept on the dress, and he would have known you fast enough. But in other ways you must be careful, for Peterlee says Meadownunkle is always in a bad temper now, and won't say a word to anyone." Heidi said good night, and climbed up the mountain slope, carrying her basket on her arm. The evening sun shone all round about on the green mountain pasture, and at this moment the vast snowfield of Casaplana came into view, and shone afar. Every other step or so, Heidi had to stand still and look over her shoulder, for the high mountains were behind her as she struggled on up the trail. Suddenly, a red glow shone on the grass at her feet. She turned around and, oh! She had forgotten that the glory of the world was so great. It had not been like this even in all her dreams. The horned cliffs of Falkness Mountain flamed up to the sky. The broad snowfield was all alight. Pink clouds were slowly moving across the blue heaven. The grass about her on the meadow was melted gold. The light twinkled and shone from the crags, and below her the valley swam in a sea of golden mist. Heidi stood in the midst of this splendor, and bright tears of joy streamed down her cheeks. She folded her hands and gazed up at the sky above her, and gave thanks aloud to dear God that he had brought her back home again. She thanked him that all his works were so beautiful, much more beautiful than she had ever thought, and that they were once more hers to enjoy. And Heidi found herself so fortunate and so rich in this great glory that was all around her. She could hardly find the right words with which to thank her God. Heidi could not tear herself away from the spot until the light around her began to pale. But then she ran up the mountain so fast that it was not long before she saw ahead of her the tops of the fir trees above the roof. A moment later, the roof itself hove into sight, and then the cottage, and finally the figure of grandfather, as he sat on the bench by the hut and smoked his pipe. And above the whole scene, the tops of the old fir trees rocked and rustled in the evening breeze. Then Heidi ran all the faster, and before Meadow Nuncle could see what was coming, the child flew straight up to him, threw down her basket, and clasped her arms tightly about him. She was so excited at seeing him again that she kept repeating the one word over and over, "Grandfather, grandfather, grandfather." Nor did the old gentleman have anything to say. His eyes grew wet for the first time in many years, and he had to brush his hand across them. Then he loosened Heidi's arms from his neck, set the child upon his knees, and studied her closely for a moment. "So you've come home again, Heidi," he said after a pause. "How does that happen? You don't look especially proud and haughty. Did they send you away?" "Oh, no, grandfather," Heidi assured him eagerly. "You mustn't think that. They were all so good to me, Clara and Grandmamma and Mr. Sesemann. But you see, grandfather, I just couldn't stand it any longer not to come back to see you. But I never have said anything about it, of course, for that would have been naughty. And then, one morning, all of a sudden, Mr. Sesemann sent for me very early. But I do really believe the doctor made him do it, but I suppose that is all written down in the letter." Heidi wriggled down from grandfather's knees, took her letter and the rolled package from her basket, and handed him both of them. "This belongs to you," the old gentleman said, and laid the roll, which was money, down beside her on the bench. Then he took the letter and read it through. Without a word, he thrust it into his pocket. "Do you think you could still drink a little milk with me, Heidi?" he then asked, taking the child's hand to go into the hut with her. "But bring your money along. You can buy yourself a whole bed with that, and clothes enough to last you for several years." "I don't need the money for anything, grandfather," Heidi said. "I have a good bed already, and Clara packed so many clothes for me. I surely won't need any more ever." "Take it just the same, and put it in your closet, for the time will come when you need it." Heidi obeyed him and hopped along after him into the cottage. She was overjoyed to see everything again. She ran into the corners and climbed up the ladder, but in the loft she stopped suddenly and called down to him, "Oh, grandfather, I've lost my bed." "It will be back again soon," he called to her from below. "We didn't know you were coming home. Here's your milk now." Heidi climbed down and sat in her old place on the high stool. She seized her bowl and drank the milk so eagerly that you would think she had never had anything so delicious in all her life. When she had finally set down her bowl, with a deep breath, she said, "Nothing in the world is half so good as our milk, grandfather." At that moment a shrill whistle sounded outside. Heidi shot out of the door like a flash of light. There came the whole troop of goats, skipping, dancing, and jumping down from above, and Peter himself in the midst of them. When he saw Heidi, he stood stock still, as if he had suddenly taken root in the ground, and stared at her in silence. "Good evening, Peter," Heidi called, and fairly rushed in among the goats. "Oh, Barely dear, and Schweinli, do you still remember me?" And it truly seemed as if the goats knew her voice, for they rubbed their heads against the child and began to bleat aloud for joy. Heidi called them all by name, one after the other, and they ran around in wild confusion and crowded upon her. The impatient goldfinch sprang over the backs of 2 other goats to reach her without delay, and even Snowhopper, with an unexpected lowering of his head, butted aside Big Turk, who, in great surprise at such treatment, could only raise his bearded head high into the air to show who he was. Heidi was almost beside herself with joy to have her old companions back. She hugged delicate little Schneehöppli again and again, stroked Distelfink, and was pushed and thrust one way and another by the affectionate goats, until she finally came up to Peter, who had not moved from where he stood. "Come down here, Peter, and wish me good evening," Heidi now called to him. "So you've come back again!" he exclaimed in much surprise. And then he came forward and took Heidi's hand, which she had been holding out to him this long time, and he asked, as he always did when they were coming home in the evening, "You're going to be with me tomorrow?" "No, not tomorrow, but the next day perhaps. Tomorrow I have to go to grandmother's." "It's fine to have you back again," Peter said, and his face got all twisted up in a grin of huge delight. Then he prepared to start on with the goats. But never before had he had such trouble with them. First, it was all he could do, coaxing and threatening, to gather the goats around him. And then, when Heidi had started off with one arm around Schweinli's neck and the other about Bearly's, the whole herd suddenly wheeled and ran after the three. Heidi had to take her 2 goats into the shed and close the door, or Peter would never have managed to get his flock headed down the mountain. When the child came back into the cottage, she found her bed already made up. It was high and sweet-smelling, for the hay had been freshly brought in, and grandfather had spread the clean linen sheets over it very carefully. Heidi lay down on it with real pleasure, and had the best night's sleep that she had had for a whole year. During the night, grandfather must have got up at least 10 times to climb into the loft and to listen carefully to Heidi's breathing, so he might be sure she was having a good rest. He examined the window where the moon used to shine in on Heidi's couch to see if the hay was still where he had stuffed it, because from now on he intended to keep the moonlight out, so as not to allow it to waken the child with its brightness. Heidi slept on without waking, and she no longer wandered about in her sleep. Her great longing for home had been stilled. She had again seen all the mountains and cliffs caught in the evening glow. She had once more listened to the deep roaring of the fir trees, and was at home on the mountain meadow. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to Heidi. I'd love to hear your suggestions for future stories, so please send an email to me at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.